Welcome, everybody, to this week's edition of the International Cannabis Conversation. I'm your host, Chris Day, co-founder of Project Evolve and the Global Cannabis Network Collective. Thanks to TRICHOMES.com for allowing us to do this on a bi-weekly basis. The last interview that I had, it took us to India, and we've been able to talk to folks in Israel and South America. But today we're recording our first session of 2021. Very excited to be out of that last year. Super focused on making sure that for all of us, 2021 becomes a year that we define our own future and help push things forward. And in looking at that, we're going to start the year off with a discussion about Europe. And today joining me is Jamie Schau. She's the International Research Manager at Brightfield Group, which is a global cannabis and CBD market research firm. Jamie and the team at Brightfield Group conducted in the last quarter of last year, or I guess in the fall, so not quite sure of the exact timing, a great report in conjunction with Hanway Associates looking at the state of Europe and sort of the future state of Europe in the coming years. So Jamie, welcome. Thanks so much for joining me today on the International Cannabis Conversation.
Thank you, Chris, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's you've spent a lot of time looking at a host of global markets, and you guys chose to work with Hanway, I noticed. And what was the impetus for this collaboration? Because at the GCNC, we're all about global collaboration and trying to bring people together. It's part of what was the impetus behind this podcast, but sort of what brought you two together to build this report?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a lot in common with Hanway. We thought that this would be a really good opportunity to leverage their expertise to better get to know and delve into the European landscape, given that they have boots on the ground and they're very well connected there. They were indeed an excellent resource for us, provided us tons of insight just from their own experiences. And we too like to collaborate and respect the value of other professionals in the field. That's actually a lot of what our methodology covers. It's a multi-source methodology that collects information where it's available, right? So that varies certainly by country and continent, but often interviews with industry experts from across the supply chain is a major factor there, and Hanway is an excellent expert team of cannabis consultants in the UK, to give a little context. So they absolutely offered that, and they were also able to introduce us to a lot of their own partners. So ultimately that was the goal there, and they wanted to be able to count on sort of third-party data for their own on their side as well. So that was something we were able to provide to them in turn.
Great. Yeah, I've watched the Brightfield Group's work for a number of years. It's always very good. You guys seem to have a great methodology. And I think you've been there since 2015, right?
That's right. Yeah, 6 years almost. Yep, 6 years.
Yeah, which in cannabis years, I'm told, is, approaching 35 years perhaps in total movement. So
roughly.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of change, and I've enjoyed our conversations quite a lot. You and I have talked about Europe, of course, but also Latin America and the shifting trends there. And sort of at the hub of a lot of the global marketplace is Europe, and people can download the whole report or an executive summary of the report off your website. It's a great piece. I encourage people to do that. But I see Europe as really the global hub of forward movement at the moment. So I really enjoy being able to take a look at what's happening. What How do you feel about that? I mean, do you think that's an accurate statement? And if so, or not, sort of where do you think Europe is leading us as a market?
Yeah, absolutely. So it depends on what you're looking at, right? So everyone's got sort of their own interest in these various markets, and we of course we look at CBD markets sort of separately from cannabis markets, so that's a whole nother animal. But from the medical perspective, or from the legalized cannabis perspective, I do think Europe's very, very promising, especially on the medical front. For various reasons, there does seem to be a tide turning towards more social and cultural acceptance of cannabis. There's a massive population there, higher GDP per capita, meaning basically more spending power. There's a tremendous amount of potential. As to whether it's necessarily going to be the biggest market of the future, time will tell, right? I mean, when we're covering the U.S., especially well, this will be live later, but today is the Georgia election runoff, so we can imagine that there's a lot up in the air in terms of the U.S.'s prospects moving forward, Canadian, for that matter, Latin America, all kinds of stuff happening in around the world. But Europe is absolutely, I think, one of the more solid and I think stable markets, which in and of itself is a huge achievement, right? Because you've got a lot of volatility in cannabis, and that makes it hard to invest and to grow and plan for the future. So we do see medical markets in Europe as an excellent prospect, especially because of the way that they've transpired. They haven't grown in the same way that they have, say, in North America, where we've seen essentially medical markets in Canada and the U.S. specifically they've been a springboard into recreational adult use markets. And often, those are the same suppliers, sometimes even the same distribution channels. A lot of overlap there, and sort of the recreational or the adult use markets eat up the medical markets in a lot of cases, or make them much less relevant and appealing. Whereas in Europe, everything is very strictly medical. You get a doctor's prescription, and you go to a pharmacy almost universally to access your product, like you would with any other prescription medication. And there's really been a separation of recreational markets or potential pilot programs, really. So I don't necessarily see the same competition from adult use markets that we're seeing in North America. So in that sense, the medical side is also very
based
promising.
on what I was reading in your report, I mean, to me, it feels like the market growth potential comes from the expansion of defining what medical use is and the diversification of the product set available. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely. Well, and not just the diversification, but ultimately the pricing adjustments that are also associated with greater competition and opening up of bottlenecks that exist. So a lot of what we see in that sense is regulatory barriers, right, that are limiting the formats of products that are available. Often, right now it's mostly extracts and flower. It's actually pretty much universally those two things. Whereas you might see eventually might evolve to allow for more product from greater number of competitors at different or better quality levels. The other barrier that we're seeing pretty widely is physician comfort with prescribing cannabis, and how that works very, very much varies by country. But that adoption has been a real limiting factor. So as physicians and pharmacists become more comfortable with these products, we do expect a lot of growth stemming from that.
And
then there's other issues related to pricing, and we expect lowering pricing.
Yeah, on the physician training programs, it was interesting to me, because as I look around the world, especially those markets where it's clear medicinal and sort of pharmaceutical approach is going to be the lead. Those markets where they spend time talking to the physicians to help destigmatize the conversation and provide these folks with data, that's where success seems to happen most quickly. It was a substantive part of my discussion with Abhishek Mohan from Hemp Street out of India, right? He's spending an immense amount of time educating physicians there. And I think, you've got similar programs happening in the UK and Germany. And I know that looking at Mexico, there's groups down there trying to get ahead of that curve as well, doing the same thing. But when I talked to Sita Schubert from the EU Medicinal Cannabis Association a couple of weeks ago, she was also talking about sort of the grassroots push in a lot of these countries from patients to speed up the rate of prescriptions. And so that push, I'm assuming, helps. Did you guys get a chance to look at sort of how those dynamics were helping to either expand or limit the market between consumer activism and education programs and all of that?
We did consider it. Ultimately, we're not an advocacy organization.
I'm absolutely aware of that.
So that's not really the focus. Although I do think by the nature of our work, we are advocating for viable cannabis markets, right? And we do absolutely look at that. And we find that there's a business case for cannabis, which is sort of for your pragmatists, for your policymakers, for your business leaders, right, entrepreneurs. And then there's also a human interest component that's extraordinarily important. And I think the strongest, there's very specific cases. The Caldwells, for example, in the UK, and a lot of people know the Figgy family regarding the CBD movement in the US. That was really, really the catalyst for CBD becoming really legalized and just exploding in the US. Was this CNN story on by Sanjay Gupta covering that family and their journey to access medical cannabis, right? So that's really served, I think, to grow popular awareness and in a sense ultimately has really driven consumer interest and approval of especially medicinal cannabis. And I think that fight has been fought and in a lot of cases won already. The tides have really turned already, but ultimately how that translates into policy is a bit of a different animal. Because I keep using the US, but just to pull from a local example, we know we have very broad, across party lines, support for cannabis in the US, but we don't have it federally legalized, right? And we still have states that are holding back on medical programs, and many states that aren't legalized on the adult use side. It doesn't always translate, but I think it helps. But ultimately, the educational component, the research components, those are a lot more compelling to physicians, to policymakers that have to answer to constituents, that have to be responsible for their patients. So ultimately, that's what we've seen is the two elements are both important. Yep. And when we're publicizing our data and our research, we absolutely pursue both avenues because ultimately they all lead to the growth of the industry and more sort of cultural recognition and adoption of cannabis and accepting it as a medicine.
And I know in your report you were saying that I think the total market size in Europe in 2020 was projected to be around 360 million, 200 and give or take. You probably know the numbers better than I do. And Germany controlled a good 2/3 of that. But there were all these other countries coming up as well and growing other than Germany and the UK, which is politically important, but as a market is very small at the moment. Who do you think the other sort of market leaders are in the European region?
Today, you mean, or expected
today
in the future?
And in the future? Because I firmly believe it's going to change, but I'm speculating, and you've actually looked at the data, so.
Yeah, so that's a really valid point, and I think I asked to clarify because they're just really they're different answers after we get beyond Germany, right? So I do think Germany is going to continue to be very much a leader, because for several reasons, which includes pretty broad insurance coverage of cannabis products. Really less barriers in front of patients, ultimately, and again, high per capita income. It's essentially been normalized there to a much greater extent, and it's financially accessible to a lot of patients. So we do expect them to continue to grow as domestic cultivation ramps up, and with different pricing structures evolving, lowering prices for patients ultimately. In the future, we also see, today, we see the UK as quite a small market. It's just been very, very limited in terms of products that have actually effectively been made available to patients, and they're still quite pricey. The NHS, the local health authority there, has been hesitant and pretty limited in its prescribing. We see that growing actually to a large extent outside the NHS through private clinics, which have really sort of taken the baton and just started independently making forward momentum happen. So that one's an interesting one. For various reasons, we expect it to grow. One being that we expect, rather than only specialized physicians being able to prescribe, we expect generalists to be able to prescribe, which makes it a lot more approachable for a lot of patients. Again, we're seeing these movements, for example, from Project 2021, that are looking to get lower priced, accessible product onto the market, or get producers on board for that. So we expect sort of a trend in that direction, so that patients can purchase it out of pocket if they need to, and more reasonably so than if they're having to buy Sativex, for example, or another pharmaceutical drug indicated within the confines of what NHS is asking for. Those are we're expecting to be the main couple of growers over time. We also see a lot of potential in Denmark. We see potential in France, even, although I will say that's probably going to be a longer term play. They've got a pilot program just starting to take shape, and once that's finalized over the course of 3 years, then we expect, theoretically, after that they will approve a larger medical program, and there's a huge potential patient base there.
That French study is interesting, though. I have spent a lot of time reading up on that, and actually was talking to some folks in Paris in December about it, because my two favorite words to use when talking about Europe is pragmatic and patience. If you understand that it's going to be very pragmatic and you have patience, I think the opportunity in France, for example, will be high. The barrier to entry is also very high because they've got some very interesting requirements on, making sure that you have French partners, and all absolutely justified, and I think smart in the long term. But for people who are used to seeing enormous growth rates in a matter of months in emerging markets, France is not going to be your place. It's definitely going to take time. I agree with that, but I find it intriguing. I enjoyed talking a couple of years ago in Paris with people who are trying to get into the space, and now they have that opportunity. So as long as you measure it in decades, you're okay.
Well, that's the challenge, right? Is we've got a lot of investor expectations in the cannabis space, because it's evolving, because people often don't understand it, and they can't really compare it to wider mainstream CPG markets like alcohol, and there were a lot of expectations around sort of these massive booms, explosions in growth, and those didn't take place, right? Their growth has been slower than anticipated, largely due to red tape, primarily due to red tape, right? Especially in Europe. So we see European growth as this slow swell. It's not going to be J-curve growth. That would be extraordinarily hard to achieve under the circumstances. That said, this market evolves so frequently, right?
Yeah.
Even since we published this a couple of months ago, there have been regulatory changes. There have been data published, this, that, and the other thing. So those things could change, but generally, those markets are there. Just meeting that demand is what needs to improve, and streamlining the whole supply chain. And those will ultimately be the growth catalysts over the longer term. But yes, France that's a challenging one, right? So just a little tidbit on that is for the French pilot, product has to be furnished to patients for free, right? So if you're going to invest in that space, you have to be very serious, right? You have to be playing a long game, because you're not making any profit off of those first 3 years, it's not for the faint of heart, right? It needs to be an established player that's going to be able to maintain that stock and provide for patients at a quality product over a longer term, and ultimately playing the long game and trying to have an advantage when it comes to a larger market's legalization.
Yeah, it will be interesting to continue to watch that, and it's funny though, you say it's not going to be J-curve growth, and yet your projections still have growth from 359 million in 2020 to 3.1 billion by 2025. In most markets, that would be considered J-curve. Right, so it's still a pretty
sure.
astronomically
Okay, fair
high
enough.
number. So.
It is certainly, it's a rapid clip.
Yeah, but that's taking into account the Germany.
I think part of that too is that. Well, and I'm also speaking historically. Like a lot of these markets have been legal for quite some time, right? And we're still here, kind of puttering around at 300 million when you could see billions moving in other countries. So it is a kind of longer game. And the other thing too is that growth is mostly stemmed in Germany specifically. So we'll see a lot of growth elsewhere, but it's not quite the same trajectory that we'll see that we initially were expecting to see, for example, in Canada or even in Europe,
right.
5 years ago.
Yeah, and you mentioned Canada, and I want to talk about the money flow a little bit, because you referenced it in the report. It's been a hot topic of conversation for at least the last 6 to 9 months. If not earlier, there was speculation. But, the fact that there was this immense investment of capital out of Canadian companies early on, and now they've, many, not all, but many have pulled back or become much more restrictive because that's how the market has worked. I see that personally as an opportunity for European companies to help control their own destiny somewhat. But it also does raise the question of where is future capital going to come from to help drive this growth, especially when you have programs where you can't see a positive return on investment for at least 3 to 4 years because you got to give stuff away. So how are you guys seeing that playing out in terms of capital sources and investment to help drive the growth?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it is something that we've addressed, because I agree with you. Generally, the not withdrawal, but the decreased investment from the Canadian LPs has opened up a bit of additional room for local players to actually really get in there and take advantage of the opportunities with local advantages, right? They've got the infrastructure, they've got EU GMP certification should be much easier. They're not going to need to ship so far or ship at all, really. So there are certainly advantages to local players, and those are hard to see when you've got billion-dollar players to compete with. But now those opportunities for Canadian companies are narrowing a bit. So it is opening up that space. But in terms of capital available, honestly, in cannabis, it seems to be infinite. There's so much interest in this space and so much really just a genuine belief that it is going to grow and grow well. Yeah. Investors know this, right? So granted, the Canadian LPs might wane. They also might continue to grow after they've gotten through these initial hurdles, sort of in Canada, right? So we just recently saw that Aphria and Tilray merged,
huge move.
And that's enormous, right? Enormous move in Canada and in Germany in particular. Really wanting to hone in on their European capacity too. That was part of what that deal entailed. So huge potential still there. I don't mean to convey the message here that the Canadian LPs are going to vanish. They absolutely are still a presence in Europe, and then they're going to continue to be. But I do think, Australian players, U.S. players, there are quite a few different entities that are currently looking at these markets, very interested, and might potentially have a whole lot of investment and capital growth themselves internally that they'll be investing in Europe in the future, beyond what's happening in Europe itself among local players. There's always more where that came from, but I do think that how things have evolved thus far should be a lesson to investors in setting expectations, not expecting that you are going to invest today and in 6 months you're going to be a bajillionaire. That's just not what happens. It's got to be thoughtful and really looking at what the market's actually demanding.
I often talk to people, and I used it about the U.S. market for a long time, and it played out, and I think Europe is following the same thing, right? If we remember back into the 90s with the tech boom and how all of that happened, and there was a whole lot of money that went into companies that didn't really have their stuff figured out, but then the ones that did over time really ruled the world later. And I think that that's sort of where we're at. And I do hope that some of the lessons that we've learned because of the way cannabis is structured, with so many legal barriers, it sort of slowed the roll of that sort of monetary enthusiasm, I think. But it meant that maybe we learned some of the lessons. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that maybe we learned some of the lessons without just having to blow up tons and tons of great capital. We'll see. I mean, if things change and people get hyperactive again, I suppose I could be proven wrong. Probably will be. It seems to happen regardless.
Like I said, there's just infinite enthusiasm around the sector, which is fantastic in terms of growth and innovation. And I do think ultimately it is a bit similar to the .com era in that those that are ultimately hitting the goalposts and actually appealing to consumers and their needs and competing with a thoughtful business plan, those will absolutely be. I think they're really well positioned to come out really successfully at the other end. But we're seeing Canada's really the foundation for this, or where it's really happening right now. Things are shaking out, right? Sort of the wheat is separating from the chaff, and we're going to see probably by year's end a lot of M&A activity, perhaps some bankruptcies, and really a different landscape. And that's because ultimately products and services are either improving and surviving, or they're not. Yeah. And that's no different in Europe.
Right.
Other than that, I think Europe is more medically oriented, and it might be a bit more pharmaceutical in nature.
Yeah, is the plan for the fall report to be sort of an annual thing? Is that where you guys are headed with that?
So typically it varies by market, right? We cover European cannabis separately than CBD, and we try to get those out every 6 months. So honestly, if I could, I would update them weekly. That's about how often there's news. But that's, practically speaking, that's how often we're doing them, and we do them on a quarterly basis in the major markets. But that's the reason.
The reason, Jamie, I was asking was not to put you on the spot, so I apologize for that. It was really because I think the market is moving and evolving and changing so fast that the next time it comes up, I want to make sure we have you back on again and talk through it some more, because it is certainly one of the great. It's the great and most important, one of the great and more important markets in the world, and will sort of help predict the future of cannabis globally by the path that Europe goes down. So, know that you have a seat at the conversational table anytime those come out, because I think it's important that we keep our audience updated wherever they are in the world on what's happening in Europe, because all of those different countries and all of those different pilot projects that are happening, whether they're medicinal or adult use or hybrid, is the future of a very large sum of money and the future of millions and millions and millions of medicinal cannabis patients. So,
yes, absolutely. Well, I appreciate the invite, and we'd be happy to do that. And ultimately, it's a fascinating market to work with. I mean, I cover the globe theoretically, but really what that means for practical purposes is markets that are active. But even within that scope, that's changed 4 times in 2020, right?
Yeah.
And we're, I mean, look at even just in the last few weeks, we've got Israel going through and Mexico going through all these different changes. New Zealand, Germany, all considering adult use markets. That's just even within the space of a year, and that's not even to speak of the competitive landscape and all the company changes and the internal politics and regulatory changes that at the switch of a small policy might have enormous repercussions for the industry. So those are things we do try to keep up with as well as we possibly can. Again, we published this data back in November, so some things have even changed since then. But we do. And I also wanted to mention, Chris, since you brought it up earlier, but what's on our site is an executive summary. It's exactly what you said. It's not the full report. That's a subscription basis, but that is all available on our website, and we'll be certainly updating it soon.
Great.
We'll be happy to.
Yeah, well, give me sneak peeks into the numbers, man. I'm always interested in that. And so thank you, Jamie, for joining us on the International Cannabis Conversation today. And we look forward to talking to you in the future. For all of you out there in internet land listening and watching, please subscribe, check us out. If you have questions, never hesitate to reach out to us. We're on Facebook and LinkedIn and all the social media platforms, and you can always find us on TRICHOMES.com as well. So until next time, happy travels, everybody, virtually for now, but hopefully as it's 2021, we'll get to see folks in person.